Thank you so much for joining us on this amazing webinar that is coming to you live from Kampala. My name is Dr. Dan Goto. I'm the Executive Director of Innovations for Development. Us, together with the Kampala Initiative and the People's Health Movement, do often collaborate to come up with a series of webinars that we organize on the conversation around decoloniality. If you're not new, you must have really been a consumer of some of the previous webinars that have touched amazing from aid, financing in the global health architecture, and many other issues. Today, we are privileged to join, an amazing organization that is facilitated and made this possible, called Debt Justice. Debt Justice is in the UK and working on issues of debt and coloniality for many years. And if you are familiar with the history, and my comrade Tess will tell you, it's been at the center of the conversations around freeing us from the debt, from the burden of debt. So today, the conversation is also attracting eminent panelists from across different organizations, and I'll introduce them later. But briefly, let me take you through quickly as members come in to join us about the Kampala Initiative. My tech people could, yes. So the Kampala Initiative is just a loose coalition of people who think alike, and they are thinking that indeed there is need to have a conversations about coloniality and decolonize, particularly aid and its manifestations and functions. So we believe as advocates and organizations that coalesce within the Kampala Initiative that indeed we must decolonize and aid, we must critique the narrative, but we must center the conversation of solidarity and promote a just world that brings us together, not as a result of our divides, but as common humanity. I would urge you to, if you are new, please come and join us. There's a post in the chat that we can read more about the Kampala Initiative and join the cause. And we often meet, regularly to share and learn from one another, but also to network and find solutions to some of the problems that we struggle with within the framework of decoloniality. Having said that, my tech, please move to the next slide. Yeah, we often organize webinars, and if you get to the link, I think we can share the link. We've had a series of webinars held so far: legacies of coloniality and development assistance, decolonizing the human resources for health, decolonizing health research, decolonizing global health governance, perspectives of Africa, and then aid localization as we see it as a response to fixing the challenges within the aid systems. And today, we are making a fantastic connection, really, that has not been made before, linking debt to coloniality and colonialism. It's an intricate subject that is not well understood by many, including me, having been in the game for quite some years. So because of the need to understand and unpack it more, we thought that it is necessary to invite the actors who have been in the game for many years. So I want to congratulate and thank Debt Justice for holding the flag high and trailblazing with these conversations and the initiatives that they are planning ahead in the coming year. So thank you so much for having us, and indeed we thank you for the initiatives, but also they are agreeing to be part of this conversation. So ladies and gentlemen, I just really want to go to briefly introduce the panelists that are going to be here with us and share their perspectives. So I'll begin with Tess. Tess is a senior policy and research officer at the Justice, working on the link between debt and climate change and the colonial nature of debt. Tess used to be involved actually with the Campaign Initiative when he worked with Health Poverty Action. Actually, she's the original pioneers. So she's just coming home. She's not new. Another comrade, very eminent person is Bhumika. Bhumika is a feminist and decolonial political economist and an advocate and activist on global economic justice. She currently works at the Third World Network as a senior advisor and advocate on global economic governance and justice. Thank you so much, Bhumika. And I know you are in the US and the time difference. If we can't have you, we're glad already we have the recording with us. But I see you there already. Oh no, I think not yet. Another wonderful person is May. I'm bad with names. Apologies if I wrongly pronounce it. Buenaventura currently works with the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, a regional alliance based in the Philippines. As a program manager of the Debt and Green Economic Rebuilding Program, she's tasked with advocacy and campaigning on debt justice, specifically for the cancellation of unsustainable debt, including illegitimate debt, to help enable people to deal with the multiple crises and enjoy their rights. For a stop to the, she also campaigns for a stop to the destruction of the environment through lending, and for the end of the over-reliance on borrowing, and of course the financial and economic systems to stop the accumulation of unsustainable illegitimate debt as a form of building equitable and just post-carbon societies. So thank you so much, May. We would be glad to have you to share your perspectives from Asia. Another amazing comrade from the continent is Tirivangani. I very well been following him on social media. He's from Aphrodite and is the lead person on debt. He has vast experience on debt issues acquired through leading the portfolio, whose key objective is to contribute to finding sustainable solutions to Africa's debt crisis and the aversion of future debt. Under this portfolio, he takes the lead on issues around responsible borrowing, debt management, and debt restructuring mechanisms. Thierry holds a Master's of Science degree in International Relations, a Bachelor of Science degree in Political Science from University of Zimbabwe, and postgraduate certificate in International Development Studies from the University of Oslo. Thierry, I'm glad to have you to give us the Afrocentric perspective of debt and what it means to us. So, ladies and gentlemen, with that, this meeting is recorded, and I must announce that a lot of the views that happen, the listening in, happen post the meeting. So often people come in late, but they request the recordings and we share them on the different platforms. So for management of time, we will start and have the recordings circulated to all our audiences who may not have come in time. So with that, allow me to have my tech people telecast what Bhumika has shared for us. Over to you, Frank, and the recording. Frank, if you are not able, I'm going to ask Tess to telecast the recording from Bhumika.
Yeah, I can do the first part. Shall I start that now?
Go ahead, Tess.
Okay. Bear with me 1 second. Let's see. Okay, let's try it this way. Let's escape this. Let's go here.
Greetings, everyone. Sorry I cannot be with you today. However, here is my presentation, and I hope you received this video. It will be a contribution on reparations related to the colonial global economic order, and it centers on the structural drivers of inequality and the systemic ways in which injustice is continually reproduced. I'll start with a brief overview of what is involved in a concept and approach for holistic reparations of economic injustices past to present, which includes resource drains from fiscal wealth and commodity drains from the colonial past to the financial imperialism of the present. Second, I'll go over colonial logics that shape the unequal world economic order via civilizing mechanisms that produce compliance, is good financial citizenship, disciplinary mechanisms, as well as the structures of risks and threats and penalties. And third, I'll conclude with what would be considered in structural policy change in terms of the long-standing advocacy calls for global civil society over the last several years, if not decades, around the debt restructuring mechanism, a global tax justice body in the UN, revamping of trade rules, and ending austerity. In decolonial and holistic reparations, this involves starting with historicizing and politicizing the world economic order through unpacking colonial logics, narratives, and mechanisms from the institutional to the psychological. This allows for a process of exposing and understanding the logics, narratives, and techniques that constructed the beliefs and structures and the institutional orders that facilitated colonial and capitalist development and power over the longue durée. Such a process of tracing is about a recursive dialogue with the space-time continuum of imperialism, not necessarily to revert back or to go backwards, but rather to trace forward the coherence of colonial logics from past to present in order to strategize the way forward. This involves, for example, identifying financialization and its racialized and gendered manifestations as a civilizing mechanism replete with disciplinary mechanisms such as credit rating agencies, macroeconomic surveillance report, and access to credit. Climate change is then perceived not only from fossil capitalism, but also from the lens of ecological imperialism, where centuries of commodity extraction, such as cotton, timber, sugar, and spices across colonies, eroded ecological health well before the advent of fossil capitalism. The asymmetric monetary resources of nations is understood by politicizing fiscal space through the history of wealth drain from past to present. On this sense, drawing on nearly 2 centuries of data on tax and trade, economist Utsa Patnaik in 2018 calculated that the British Empire drained nearly 45 trillion pounds from India between 1765 to 1938. In perspective, 45 trillion in current amount is 17 times the GDP of the UK today. This is not simply a historical travesty. This wealth transfer actually diffused capital and resources across Europe and North America in order to create the settler colonies of the current moment in terms of producing the very economic resources for industrialization and the consolidation of wealth and economic power. Fast forward to the present moment, empirical research conducted by academics in 2018 also quantifies financial drain from the global south through unequal exchange since 1960, amounting to 62 trillion. And when accounting for lost growth in the south, almost 152 trillion. The research group Global Financial Integrity illustrates that the South also lost approximately 7.8 trillion due to tax evasion and avoidance carried out primarily by firms and investors in industrialized countries during the 10-year period from 2004 to 2013. Africa loses approximately 90 billion a year through tax evasion and theft, half of which occurs through exports of commodities such as gold, diamonds, and platinum. We see here that the 20th century may have dismantled colonialism's judicial and political institutions. However, its colonial logic and systemic organization of wealth drain from south to north, governed through unequal power relations, not only prevail, but actually reproduce and expand in far more sophisticated and insidious forms. This act of tracing the continuity counteracts the colonial amnesia in the practice, policy, and institutions of international development, which remains depoliticized and neutralized through technocratic language and formulations. Reparations activists and movements remind us that this colonial amnesia or concealment is not simply an act of forgetting the colonial past or a simple result of ignorance, but rather a deliberate act of dissociating the links between past and present, and between metropole or donor, lender, and colony or recipient borrower. This allows for not only the material and technological superiority of the global north and its legitimacy as an aid donor rather than reparations debtor, but it also leaves the public face of morality and historical culpability intact. I move now to focus on debt colonialism in particular. So more than 60 nations in the South have directed more of their public financial resources, already scarce, already under duress due to economic downturn, and even so more now due to inflation and monetary tightening, a stronger dollar, depreciated domestic currencies, capital outflows, more expensive debt payments, more expensive import payments. And in this context, so many developing countries are directing more of their scarce financial resources to debt servicing rather than to health and economic recovery in the midst of the multiple systemic crises today. As a result, total debt in the developing world now stands at a 50-year high. 60% of low-income countries are in debt distress or high risk of debt distress, while middle-income countries such as Sri Lanka have already defaulted on their debt with devastating gender and intersectional social consequences. The World Bank has stated that over the next 12 months, as many as a dozen developing economies could prove unable to service their debt. The implication is nothing less than the greatest debt crises in developing economies in over a generation. The response to the unfolding debt, climate, and pandemic crises has been predictably and catastrophically insufficient. While the G20 moved quickly in the spring of 2020, its debt service suspension initiative was primarily meant to ease pressure on low-income countries already facing debt distress before the shocks of COVID. However, as the debt justice campaigns and advocacy movements have noted, this was only ever a stopgap solution with only limited success. Between May 2020 and June 2021, the 46 countries that applied for debt suspension under DSSI had less than a quarter, or 23% of their debt suspended. 10.3 billion worth of payments were delayed, while countries in enough distress to seek relief through the program have made 36.4 billion in payments over the same period to private creditors as well as to the World Bank, which chose not to participate in the initiative. Perversely, more than a third of these payments have been to private creditors that charge higher interest rates. More debt payments have gone to private lenders than any other type of creditor, meaning that public money intended to help lower income countries has instead gone to banks, hedge funds, and oil traders. Of course, these sums look like rounding errors in big economies' COVID stimulus measures, but they are matters of life and death for millions of people and portend even worse outcomes as climate shocks become more regular. In another perverse outcome, some countries chose not to participate in DSSI at all in fear that doing so would send the wrong message to financial markets. When Ethiopia tried to access the common framework, Fitch, as well as Standard & Moody, downgraded Ethiopia. Countries with large fiscal overhangs like Nigeria and Ghana that can access international debt markets could not take the risk that private creditors could interpret seeking debt relief as a sign of impending default, which would raise already high borrowing rates or worse, cut them off from international private finance altogether. We see today that in the midst of devastating floods, fires, and all manners of ecological and climate disaster, there is a question of how can developing countries afford to deal with extreme weather events as well as prepare themselves for the coming disasters while suffering under crippling debt loads and facing demands for austerity as the price of relief. The decision of the US Federal Reserve to raise interest rates to reduce US inflation has further pushed the value of the dollar to its highest level in 20 years. This has made the debt crisis in developing countries even more expensive since their currencies are worth less while they face increasing costs of imports. The result is that the world economy today faces the possibility of one of the worst debt crises in decades, with deep recessions, political instability, and years of lost growth and social inequality exacerbating. At the same time, the increase in extreme weather events makes life even harder for states that already dedicate a large portion of their revenues to servicing foreign debt. In the midst of this turmoil, the IMF has become even more involved in bailing out countries than it has in years. I'd like to address now what are the key mechanisms at the core of this continuity from debt colonization past to present. One mechanism is a systemic injustice where an enabling environment for private creditors or else the terms of good financial citizenship by states is exercised. Private creditors today exercise unprecedented political influence and, more importantly, structural power over much of the global South, particularly in the context of the absence of a multilateral debt restructuring mechanism and predatory private creditors that refuse to participate in debt relief or even comparability of treatment in creditor committee debt restructuring exercises. This means that assuring market confidence and demonstrating sound macroeconomic fundamentals in the eyes of financial markets requires an internalization of pro-cyclical macroeconomic policy choices that serve the
Yeah, Tess, I think we can, is the second connection ready, or we can telecast it later?
Let me just double check. I think we're going to have to do it later. I'm afraid it's still not loaded for me.
Perfect. That's fine. I think Bhumika really raises very pertinent issues to open the conversations for today. She really highlights the really sometimes unclear connection between the past, the colonization, to the current reality of that has, afforded some countries to be burdened with debt. She really mentions the present times of the criminality and tax evasion, which is protected by hegemonic actors and powerful players within the North that has sustained the erosion of resources from developing countries in that they cannot have sufficient to tax. Then they will be always perpetually be inclined to borrow to catch up with the development. She mentions really the predatory creditors and the crediting system that really uses measures and systems to rank who qualifies, who is blue, who is green, who is red, and therefore how much how much can you borrow, where can to hook from whom. So, but she ends really part of the where we disconnected from the structure, the emphasis on the structure and systemic reality that protects that hegemonic reality as something that we need to reflect on as we intentionally work towards a decolonial future where we have shared development. So with that really historical and contemporary reality of debt and coloniality, it is really at this juncture that we can bring in the perspective of Asia. How are the Asians seeing it? And from Africa, as a person looking in from far, Asia is, a space where Africa can learn, one from the liberation struggle because of our shared history of colonization, but also from the development perspective where they have moved slightly ahead in many aspects of life. Millions of people have moved out of poverty in the last 50 years, especially from China and parts of India, Malaysia, So I think with that, we can have, someone from Asia to give us that perspective. Over to you, May. Share with us,
Yes.
How is the situation in Asia and how are you fighting back to free yourself from the yoke of debt or the burdens or the shackles of debt? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Danny, and thank you for this opportunity. I hope you're hearing me clearly.
Wonderfully.
Yeah?
Clear.
Okay. So I think starting from where we are now, we're still in COVID-19 pandemic, and this really illustrated to us in the Philippines and many other countries just how weak our public health care systems are. And we find that this is rooted, like many of the social injustice and inequalities we face today, in a shared global South history of colonialism and debt enslavement. So while borrowings gave colonialist states access to cheap capital and paved the way for capital accumulation, debt was used by the colonial powers as an instrument of subjugation and elite collaboration, which trapped us in a situation of increasing debt dependence and prioritization of debt service over other public needs, as Bhumika also stated earlier. So we may think that this is all in the past, but the situation remains substantively in place today under a neo-colonialist capitalist system that is just as exploitative and extractivist and accumulates profit and wealth through the dispossession of people and the abuse of the planet. So I'm taking my country as an example. We were under Spain for about 350 years, and then under the United States for another 50 years. And while the chains may no longer be as visible as they come in other, more insidious forms, they are still very much with us and bind us to various forms of neoliberal subordination. So I'd like to quote from Tomas Sankara, whose death anniversary we commemorated last month, when he said, under whose term the Burkinabe people saw leaps in healthcare. He said that imperialism often occurs in more subtle forms: a loan, food aid, blackmail. So like many other countries of the global south, countries in Asia, including my own, have a history of social processes linked to colonialism that have eroded public health as well as human rights. So we can name extractive economies that continue to this day, unequal citizenship, labor exploitation that armed of colonial regimes. We also saw under the US the fragmentation and privatization of health service that all the more constricted access to these basic rights by the poor and lower income. All these contributed and are continuing to contribute to our contemporary health crisis, which we characterize as the gross lack of public hospitals, the brain drain as health professionals seek better work conditions elsewhere, poor health outcomes, also the imposition of fiscal austerity measures that come with loans. So if you take my country as an example, we've never really passed 5% of GDP for budget for health services. No, this has been going on for many years, and this is one of the sectors, the health sector, that has really been severely compromised by how trapped we are in debt and the myth that private big business and investors in health service will lift us up. But as we've seen, there's been really an inverse relationship between debt service and health spending. So as debt service rose, health spending declined. Very recently, I was shocked to see that in the midst of the pandemic, our budget for health was only 4.3% of the national budget. So in many countries like my own, health expenditure depends on whether you have the money or not. So it's really very heavily out of pocket, and this is recognized by government, but this is a problem that they have just been noted in their reports for many years. And when you say out of pocket, you immediately understand that the assumption that people can just draw money from their pockets, no, literally, and how and from whom they get these funds, and at which stage of their illness they do so, or what other requirements for a decent life they have to give up. These are issues that do not come into the picture. So what that results in are catastrophic health expenditures and impoverishing effects. When we say catastrophic health expenditures, this means that when you spend on health, you give up on many other basic requirements for a decent life. No? And why does our public health policy develop in this way? No, this has a lot to do with the dependence that has grown on loans, also the imposition of IMF loan conditionalities that include the privatization of basic services, and also the complicity of southern governments. So for example, there's an IMF conditionality, although they would say it's not really a requirement but a recommendation, but they advise to put a cap on public wage bills. So that includes the public health sectors, whom we saw during the height of COVID as overworked with no hazard pay, and really at the very forefront of battling this pandemic. No, another conditionality that the IMF persists or insists on is targeted rather than universal health coverage, despite the widespread evidence that targeting does not work. So even if we have a universal health law in the Philippines, the budget for this is a big question mark, as under our system, loans payments or debt service is prioritized over any other public expenditure. And then, of course, you have privatization, which we see under neo-colonialism and neoliberalism, are turning essential social services into asset classes. So the health sector becomes another asset class by which supposedly private investors should be attracted to. So the same with education and water. It's like their battle cry is like make development bankable or make development profitable. So why do we call for debt cancellation? Our call for debt cancellation is a demand that we believe cannot be divorced from our demand that governments respect, protect, and fulfill the right to health and other human rights as part of state obligation under core international treaties, because this is indeed a legal obligation when you sign on to international treaties. Now, forcing us to pay for debts, even if debt service violates rights, we think that this makes these debts illegitimate. Claiming payments from us for toxic debts that brought ill health or destroy the environment, poison and we want to be immediately and unconditionally cancelled. And it's not just, I'm not just talking about the impacts on people and the planet. Of course, these are important and we should look at that. But in addition, we should also see how debt bondage has robbed us of our agency and shapes the substance and direction of our economies in ways that strengthen debt economies. The hold of colonialism and neo-colonialism in its contemporary form, such as through neoliberal mechanisms and processes that assault women's reproductive health rights. So we see some of these core traits of colonialism in the neo-colonialist approach in health, in terms, for example, of imposing top-down solutions without consulting local communities. And there's also this tendency to be dismissive or disparaging towards indigenous knowledge. There's also this emphasis on narrow medical solutions to public health problems without raising the socio-economic factors affecting health and human rights. And there's also this instrumentalist view that if we improve the health of the population, growth will increase, labor productivity will increase. So it's pointing towards how can we improve the health of the population for more profit, for these profit ends. So at this time of great difficulty and all these narratives being woven before us in arenas where we have no voice or a say, we need to go back to our colonial or this colonial legacy, because we need to debunk the myths that caused this problem. We need to be empowered to be able to develop truly just and transformative solutions to the debt problem and to the violations of our basic rights, including the right to health. We believe that understanding the historical moorings and context of the call for debt cancellation are important steps in the direction of decolonization and freedom. We need to understand that the creditors themselves, or the lenders, created the situation of indebtedness and the need for borrowings through a long history of colonization, neo-colonization, and capitalist globalization. And this has involved the exploitation of peoples, communities, and natural resources in the economies of the South, and the consequent impoverishment of our people. We also need to look at debt as an instrument for the continued plunder of the South. So there's really a net transfer of resources from the South to the North. And what makes this system, part of what makes the system work is promoting that need to borrow, relentlessly pushing loans to governments and private corporations in the South. We also need to call out the loan conditionalities that impinge on our rights and capacities to define and direct our development programs and processes. No? And then, of course, we have to hold our own governments to account, as local elites have also been the beneficiaries of these loans and not the peoples of the South. So many of these debts helped enrich public officials, no? Like the father of our current president, Marcos Jr. No? So ultimately, we say that considering all these, no, the peoples and the countries of the South are in fact creditors of an enormous historical, social, and ecological debt of the North. From the North, South, massive debt, and not but justice and repose. So I'll end there. Thank you, Danny.
Wow. Thank you so much, May, for that wonderful, wonderful sharing with us. What my takeaway really is the connection you've made about debt to our current reality and the human perspective of it. You've highlighted of course, the historical connection that we share between us as Africans and you in the Philippines, the history of the many years of colonization, and then the outcome of that really dismantled our, systems of governance and systems of being and our power, then created a new reality that has made really debt inevitable. Because we need to develop, we need resources. But somebody out there who is the creditor is saying, you need the road, you need the hospital, you need this, but here is the money. And these are the conditions I'm giving you the money with. And those conditions, again, continue to erode our resources. You highlighted how the conditions of austerity, and that, you have to pay these wages not beyond this kind of cap so that you are able to pay back the debt. As your resources leak out to paying back debt, then you do not have sufficient resources to meet the healthcare need. You mentioned about the targeting healthcare, plans, which is not universal really, and meaning that the rest of the people are left out, either to pay out of pocket or getting to the hands of the private guys who are, earning a kill from the diseases that are affecting them. But you've made us to rethink the future without addressing the history where we're coming from, the colonial structures that were put in place and how they have, sustained the reality, which makes debt inevitable. We may not move afar, but also reflect on our governments and the people who are put in charge, how they think and how they act for and on our behalf. It's something that we should tackle. Thank you so much for that really, really wonderful sharing. I draw so many parallels between the life and situation in Philippines with a lot of what is happening in Africa. So with that, about the African situation, I have somebody to say something about the reality of debt in Africa and how we're dealing with it and fighting back, because Africa, I think, without sounding ignorant, is one of the highly indebted parts of the world. So, Comrade Tiri, please, over to you to share with us what you're doing, what you're working on, and the debt situation in Africa and how you're countering that. Thank you so much. Tiri, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Danny. Yeah, thank you for inviting me, and specifically Aphrodite to share the work that we are doing around the issues of debt. It's very interesting to be part of. I don't know if you can allow me to present without my video for the sake of my bandwidth. Is that okay?
That is fantastic. I've seen your beautiful face already. I'll keep it in my brain for a while.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so it is very interesting to be part of this discussion on debt and colonialism. I really agree with what Bemuka said, and also what Maya shared from the Asian perspective, I think we are in the same boat with regards to how devastating the debt issue is to our development as a region in Africa. But to that, I think there's a very deep-seated link between debt and colonialism, whether in the past and specifically in the present, where we are seeing so many linkages and so many disruptions to our path to development as a region or as a continent. When you look at who are our creditors currently, or who are our lenders, you will see that these are our former colonizers. That's a reality. When you look at the lending institutions that we currently have, whether they are international financial institutions, especially the World Bank and the IMF, you will find that they are dominated by our former colonizers, especially the G7, and to some extent the G20 or the OECD countries. And for years, when you look at today's financial capital markets, you find them in New York, you find them in London, and this is where currently most of our, for example, in Africa, where they are raising their Eurobonds or where they are borrowing from the capital markets. And that reality gives a sense of the history or the link between debt and colonialism. And it's a perpetuation of the same from what we had in the past to the current situation we have. Let me sort of start with a reference to a report that was produced by the IMF, the Regional Economic Outlook for Sub-Saharan Africa in October, which clearly shows that the African region, when you look at what they call public debt to GDP, they say it's around almost 60% on average. And these are levels that they say they were last seen in the 2000s, in the years of the 2000s. So it shows that the levels of debts in the region are really high. The report also noted that 19 countries out of what they call 35 low-income countries are now in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress. And some of the countries that are given as examples are Zambia, Chad, Ethiopia. I think Bemuka made reference to Ethiopia, she made reference to Zambia and Chad, that they've already sought debt restructuring under the G20 Common Framework. So we have countries already that are in high risk of debt distress. And this is really disheartening given where we are coming from as a region. That at one point we had debt relief from the HIPIC initiative and the MDRI, and now we have countries back, or we have countries that have slid back again into debt distress. The report also showed inflation that is very high. They say now in Africa, the inflation rate is double digits, which is like 40%, gone up to 40% in most of the economies. And the region is very very much affected by shocks. I think we are all aware of the impacts that the Russia invasion of Ukraine has had on the economies of not only African economies, but in the global South, where we have seen the inflation rising, we have seen commodity price volatility, we have seen food and energy prices going up, we have seen the exchange rate also swinging. We have also seen global supply chain disruption, and also a bit of other impacts. We are still within the COVID period in terms of the impacts, especially within the African region. Most of the countries are not able, for the sake of lack of resources, to support a faster and vibrant economic growth. If we are to compare to what we have seen in Europe or the OECD countries. after COVID, they injected trillions of dollars into their economies, and they have stabilized their economies. But in the region, we are still facing huge COVID-19 pandemic impacts. There are so many reasons why we are seeing a huge rise in terms of deaths in the continent. One of them is that in the past, we used to have, we used to say debt and aid are tools of colonialists. They've been used to dominate the regions, whether in Asia or in Africa. Because when you look at who gets official development assistance, there's a really historical connection to the giver. So debt and aid are instruments that are used by our former colonizers to perpetuate colonialism. One of the reasons is that our governments, when they are pursuing their development plans, they are huge budget deficits. And in order to plug those gaps, we have seen that they've gone out to borrow externally. And the other reason has also been that there's been a decline in terms of official development assistance, or ODA, official development aid. It has been declining over the past decades because of the problems, for example, in Europe itself, that they cannot afford to meet the 0.7% ODA pledge they made years back. And this has also affected our development finance in the region. There is also a decline in concessional finance. I think a lot of African countries can no longer get non-concessional finance because of their graduation from what they call middle-income countries, from low-income countries to middle-income countries, so they cannot access those facilities. This has resulted into what we are seeing currently, where the IMF is back into the whole discussion. They are back into controlling a lot of the African economies. This is through the reason that a lot of our African countries have gone back to the IMF for support. Even before COVID, they have started lining up at the IMF doors to ask for assistance to fund their development needs and programs. According to the IMF, we have seen that almost 50 billion has gone to the region, Sub-Saharan Africa region, through the emergence lending facilities.
Thierry, I'm sad to say someone is reminding me about time.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Wrap up.
Yes. So let me just go to the other points that relate to the health issue. Because of because of debt servicing challenges, or because the way we are servicing our debts is really taking away a lot of resources to finance the health sector. I think a lot of us, we are aware of the Abuja Declaration, where there was a plan to make sure that all our budget in a year, 15% goes to the health sector. A few African countries are managing that, and that's a problem. We have seen that 40% of our annual budget is going to debt servicing, if you have to compare to what is now going to the health sector. And that's a big issue. And we know the challenges behind that a lot of our governments, if you go to Angola, if you go to Zambia, to Senegal, they are spending more on debt servicing than they are spending on health. The dependence on the debt dependence, I think it's an issue that our current government needs to look into through the DRM, that is domestic resource mobilization. They can only get out of the debt dependence if they improve their DRM, their domestic resource mobilization. And here we are talking of taxation, growing the economy, and looking at other alternatives that are available. Let's curtail illicit financial flows. I think in our work as CSO in the region, this is one of the issues that we are pushing very much with the authorities or government to make sure that they curtail illicit financial flows. When we look at our natural resources, we are endowed with a lot of natural resources, but we do not control the prices of these resources. So we have an up and down boom. Whenever the prices, the international commodity prices go up, there's a dividend, but at the same time, at some point, they will go down, and that affects our financing needs. One other challenge is the resource-backed loans. A lot of our governments, it's a bit colonial because we are mortgaging future revenues from our natural resources. Countries, for example, China is using resource-based loans as a way of, in my view, it's part of the colonial game altogether. Because you mortgage your natural resources to get today and you get a loan of 20 million, but you are giving away billions of or trillions of future revenues. And this is one of the issues we need to address as CSOs, and we are pushing that as well. We have seen the infrastructure-led models where we are borrowing to finance our infrastructure, which is good, but the results or the proceeds in 20, 30 years time, they don't come there and there. So there's need for good project cost and benefit analysis there. We have also seen odious debts. When you look at the case of Mozambique, the Mozambique hidden debt scandal, where we have irresponsible borrowing and lending. So debtors and creditors really share the blame, and they need to take responsibility, especially on the lender's side or the creditor side, because they cannot disregard the national provisions in terms of debt management only for their own profits needs. One good example of how this colonialism is perpetuated through some of the instruments is the way the IMF special drawing rights have been given. I think there's a quota system that was formulated way back in the 1940s. It has never been changed, and there's resulted in deserving countries getting less resources and OECD countries getting more resources. Africa, for example, got 33 billion out of 650 billion. And it's because of the colonial nature of the special drawing rights architecture. We need to challenge that as a continent. Climate finance, I think around this month, there's a huge discussion around climate change because of COP27. There are a lot of structural issues when it comes to loans that are given to climate mitigation and adaptation. It's an issue that we need to challenge and dismantle. What we are doing as CSOs in the region is that we have a huge advocacy task, especially towards the creditors and our government as data governments. We always push for prudent debt management. We always push them to make sure that they increase their health public spending. But the bigger task of the reforms to reform the global financial architecture, especially the debt architecture, which really does not favor global south. So there is need to make sure that the global financial architecture is challenged. We need a proper, as Bumuka said, a proper debt restructuring mechanism that is at the international level, so that when countries get into challenges of debt, they can restructure their debts in a way that is quicker and faster and beneficial. Lastly, we need to challenge our leaders, especially in the continent, to be accountable, to be transparent in the way they manage the public finance management resources as well. And more so, Africa needs to industrialize. We cannot depend on the West on all our needs, especially when we look at the imports. There is a huge imports bill. We need to industrialize so that we cut on import bills. And we also need to look at other alternative financing mechanisms besides debt, so that the continent is freed from colonialism, especially neo-colonialism. Thank you very much. Let me stop there and see how it goes.
Tiris, thank you really so much for, I think you've in a few minutes really been able to paint a very interesting but disappointing picture of our reality by highlighting that, just like May said, there is a linkage to colonization and coloniality. All the creditors or those who are, whom we borrow from are primarily our former colonizers. Then, of course, the burden of debt, 60% average to GDP across Africa. However, my thinking around there, I am part of countries where the debt to GDP, like Japan, is about 400%. So the mathematics of ranking there is a little bit mind-boggling. How, for instance, the entire debt of the country like Netherlands is more than the debt of the entire Africa. But Africa is in debt distress and the Netherlands is not in debt distress. So I think that mathematics and politics of ranking of who is in distress is something that we need to unpack. Maybe because for us, they think we have little to pick from, and yet we are the people with the resources. If you look at the global commodity prices and, you know, take gold, diamond, oil, and whatever, these are resources which are in developing countries, but we don't guarantee or set the price. Our coffee, we are paid based on what those who buy it are willing to pay. So our wealth is not translating into, you know, income that we can leverage on to industrialize, as you've mentioned. That is something really critical. But you've also mentioned the need to reflect internally our leadership and our ability to find alternatives for financing our development. And then also the fight, you've said it, the fight must center around dismantling the colonial hegemonic exploitative global financial infrastructure that has really been designed to profit from our needs and our situation. And indeed, Mai also mentioned that the Asian situation is not any different. So thank you so much, Tiri, for really that wonderful perspective on what you're doing and what we can do. The conversation still goes on, and we really should have this conversation going on. So I'm going to shift a little bit to debt justice. You know, the history of debt justice, debt jubilee, and the work that they've been doing, they come from a perspective of reparation, you know, cancel the debt and that conversation. And we've seen that canceling debt may not necessarily free us, because if you remember the HIPIC program initiative that, you know, freed most of these sub-Saharan African countries from the debt, again, most of them are even worse from where they were in those years. So as a global North organization working on the space of debt and coloniality, we want to hear, what are you working on? Before we roast you, because we've seen that, I don't know how much of this is understood by people in the North, to understand that, you know, the debt is not doing any favor, even to the Northern comrades, because if the rest of the world develops collectively, then the entire world is going to benefit. So Tess, I want to come to you, especially reflecting on what you're doing, but also the interventional project that you've thought out, and how do you think it is going to contribute to the problems, to solve the problems that we are struggling with, especially here in Africa, but also Asia, as you've heard, in dismantling the colonial, you know, structures and systems that have burdened us with debt. Thank you. Over to you, Tess.
Great, thank you, Danny. And yeah, it's a tough act to follow after everyone else. Everyone's done such an amazing job. But as Danny said, I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that we have at Debt Justice at the moment with lots of other organisations that's trying to raise the colonial nature of debt in a global North and a UK setting. So I'm just going to share my screen. I have a few slides to share with you all. So yeah, as I said, I'm going to talk a bit about this project just very quickly, share a bit about it, and then I'll quickly go through some key messages from the project. But again, I'm going to breeze through because they've already been talked about very eloquently. So there's no need to go into it in too much detail. So yes, to start with, so as Danny said, Debt Justice is an organisation based in the UK that's working to end unjust debt. And we sit within the kind of wider global movement for debt justice that exists alongside APMDD and AfroDad, etc., and many other organisations. And we see our role in this as supporting the work of our allies in the global south in a UK setting. So what can we do in the UK to support work that's already happening in solidarity across the global south to address unjust debt. And one of the things that we have become increasingly aware about in the UK is the narrative around global south debt predominantly focuses on either it being a very technical financial issue, an issue of economics, where a lot of people just shut off and think that's not my issue, I can't understand this, I'm not going to engage. Or alternatively, one of the big narratives around it in the UK is the high debt levels, the result of irresponsible borrowing. It's the fault of corrupt governments, or it's the fault of irresponsible governments that aren't able to balance their books, essentially. And of course, as Terry said, there is some degree of that involved. For example, the Mozambique case he raised. But the big piece of the picture that's often missing is irresponsible lending. And this has been talked about a lot, but it's the role of powerful corporations and governments and institutions lending, knowing that they're lending in a very risky situation, in a very irresponsible situation that's causing harm to people across the global south. And we wanted to start engaging with the UK public to have this conversation, to share this history, to share this truth about unjust debt as an effort for public education, but also as an effort to grow the global movement for debt justice, to bring more people in, and not just individuals, but also people working on intersecting issues. So people in the climate justice space, in the racial justice space, in the reparations space, etc. So that's really what this project is about. So in terms of what we're doing, we've launched the project. I'll share a link to it in the chat once I finish speaking. What we've currently launched is a video, which I'll show in a minute actually, a short briefing that just starts to talk about some of the kind of the history of debt from the lens of power, and a discussion pack, which is really trying to encourage groups in the UK to sit down and start to discuss these issues more, not just to read, but to really kind of share and have a chat about it. We're also researching a longer report that is going to build on the work that's already done, but is going to include case studies and kind of really tangible examples of like what this means in reality. And then the third kind of wave, which is going to happen in the next few months, is how do we share this knowledge with people in an accessible way? So as an NGO in the UK, we often rely on reports and maybe videos occasionally, but these can be inaccessible for some communities in the UK. So what we're exploring is alternative ways that break away from kind of Western hegemonic forms of knowledge dissemination. So we're exploring things like commissioning artwork, hosting an exhibition, podcasts, etc. One thing I think that's really important for us as an NGO in the UK to recognise is this is not our story to tell. And so we've been working in collaboration with groups across the global south and intersecting groups in the UK to kind of build up the history and the areas that we focus on. And we also have an advisory group established, which May is a part of and has been a brilliant contributor to the project so far. So I just wanted to give you a flavour for the project by sharing a video that's less than 2 minutes long and pretty much summarises a little bit of what everybody's been saying today about the links between debt and colonialism. So here we go, hopefully this works.
Colonial history is one of violence, the devastation of land and resources, the enslavement of peoples, and the erasure of culture. Colonial powers transformed economies, allowing destruction to continue until today. We often think of colonialism as in the past, but our current global system is built on its foundations and recreates the same inequalities, just in different forms. The global north still dominates the global south and plunders their wealth. Lower income country debt is a legacy of colonialism and a key tool for those in power to maintain this system of extraction. Take Zambia. After decades of a struggle against British colonial rule, they won their independence in 1964, but were left with a weakened economy, vulnerable to economic shocks, and reliant on high levels of borrowing. Zambia had some debt relief, but at a price. They were forced to adopt harmful economic reforms that were devastating for the people. All the while, nothing was done to fix the broken system that created debt in the first place. This is neo-colonialism. And now Zambia is in debt crisis again, spending 3 times more on repaying debt than on healthcare. But it's not just Zambia. 53 other countries are in debt crisis, facing the decision to fund health and education or repay debts to reckless lenders. But as before, people around the world are resisting, calling for an end to neo-colonialist extraction, calling for debt cancellation and a fairer financial system. Taking action together, we can win debt justice. Join us.
Brilliant. And I said I was going to do some key messages, but I think actually they've been brilliantly covered by everybody else. So I'll just very quickly say that I guess the kind of 4 key messages for this project are, firstly, that debt is a legacy of colonialism. The second is that debt is a neo-colonial tool that wealthy governments and institutions and corporations are using to continue to plunder the wealth and exploit countries in the global south. The third is around the human experience, which May brilliantly summarized in the case of the Philippines, of what high debt levels mean for people in real life. And the fourth is that change is possible. People across the world are resisting unjust debt systems and fighting for better structures. And I think Thierry and May have talked brilliantly about some of the work that both of their regional bodies are doing to address this. And some of the solutions that we've had in the past around debt cancellation, like Danny mentioned, haven't been enough on their own, but people are already fighting to address this. And not just debt justice, but recognizing that debt is a fundamental part of wider economic injustice and kind of linking all these things together. And it's, yeah, a real privilege to be part of this space. But yeah, I'll stop there in the interest of time, because I know we want to have a chance to have a bit of a discussion as well. But thank you so much.
Yeah, Tess, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. We're glad to have the perspective of people from the global north, because by and large, the impacts of debt and the burdens thereafter are really, you know, on the shoulders of us people in the global south. And when we connect in solidarity, is something that we really must commend. As Kampala Initiative, our goal is to see that we join hands in solidarity to fight these oppressive systems that have really subjugated other people for so many years. And thank you so much for that wonderful. And just to reiterate the key points that you've really emphasized, and even if we close from here, it is the legacy of debt is from the past. And all comrades who have shared today have emphasized that. And indeed, it's a tool that people have used to accumulate wealth. As Uganda, my country, is developing, it does not have access to resources. Or the resources we've had, or we have, are earning very little from what we need. But when the UK was developing, or the United States, it had colonies. The US, as from its creation, it was somebody's land. They anchored their development, and they are now a superpower. The UK had, you know, India, whatever. We've been told the Philippines was owned by somebody. Even up to now, the name has not changed. So that is the historical reality that we're dealing with. But the human experience, the human impact of these burdens to our people is really far beyond just merely disease. But so many people have been lost, especially as May talked about the impact of COVID and the reality that the global north printed money and distributed. The Americans did give payment vouchers to people to spend in COVID, which was money printed just out of nowhere, out of nothing. Now they've sorted their problems. Now, as the people sorted their problems, we're dealing with inflation created by them. Now, we have to accumulate millions and millions of our own money to buy the dollars in order to pay those creditors. So that means our small shillings is chasing, a lot of shillings must chase the few dollars available so that we pay back the loans. And then the consequence as a result of that, since much of us is, a lot of what we depend on is importation, and our industrialization hasn't picked up. Anyway, because of that, I really want to open it up to anybody with a conversation or a statement to make who's not been part of this. We want to involve you. We still have 15 minutes to have a dialogue on this. Please, just raise your hand if you have an opinion, a statement, or a question to anybody. To kickstart the conversation, I really want to throw this question to anybody. There's been talk about reparation. The historical mistake caused by those that caused it must pay back. The question is, what should reparation look like? And who should pay? And what should they pay? So I just want, for purposes of us to be, I know TASE, your organization, has been talking about it. Could you just quickly jump in and tell us, as we have other hands coming up?
Yeah, I can share a bit of the perspectives that we've come across, of course. So reparations, as we understand it, is a holistic term. So a part of reparations means compensating for the damage that has been created through colonialism, neo-colonialism, and enslavement. But it's only a small part of reparations. Reparations as a whole refers to healing the past, paying dues for what has been done, whether that's financial or non-financial. But it also means making sure that those same mistakes can't happen again. So it means changing the structures of oppression that we live under currently, so that the same forms of oppression that we live under now cannot be recreated. So in terms of who pays, it's not just a financial question, but it's also a question of who pays in power. How do we redistribute power in our global economy at a national and international level to ensure that the structures of oppression that we live under no longer exist, and we are able to live in a fair, just, and equitable society? That's my quick answer.
Wow, amazing. So I was going to write my blank check to my UK friends and say, hey, please, you better pay up, otherwise I need them. But thank you for unpacking that. The conversation needs to be broadened to look beyond just the monetary or the financial bit of it, but also looking at it from how do we create a better world that the historical mistakes which were created do not repeat. But when I look at the reality now in the world, it's a tall order really to achieve, because those who have power are not giving ground and they're not moving forward. May you please unmute and share with us what you have?
Yeah, one concrete example of the demand for reparations is with regard what we call the climate debt, or the debt owed to the developing countries as a result of the abuse of the environment and the atmosphere by the North. So there's a very concrete amount of money there. The 100 billion pledge that has hardly been, so little has been given, and it's even inadequate. So inadequate to deal with the climate crisis. And that's in the UN Framework Convention, that climate finance is not just any amount of money. It's climate finance based on common but differentiated responsibilities. The recognition that there's a responsibility rests heavily on those who created the situation, which we are now suffering heavily, which is, of course, the crisis of climate change. So that's one place to start. Why don't you make your pledges real? And even, you know, those minuscule amounts haven't even landed yet, and we require much more. So thanks.
Thank you so much. I think that is tangible. It is common sense, really. Thank you for saying that. I think we should start from there. And I wonder who. I think you talked about, you know, it is clear who polluted more, when, and how. We can write the check. Thank you so much. I really want to open up to anyone in the audience who really has some point to make. Just raise your hand and unmute yourself so that we can move quickly. We want you to hear. We want to hear you. Or if you can't talk and you have connection issues, we can read the chat. Did continue. Okay, there's some bit of chat here from Ravi. I'll add my piece. Okay, Ravi is saying debt continues colonial control of the global south by controlling how, well, by controlling okay, my thing is moving too fast. Controlling former colonies use and trade their own resources. This is true. Regarding the climate crisis debt, there's some discussion about Barbados and other Caribbean islands demanding climate-related debt relief and declaring a climate default on the debt, on their debt. Wow, that's really interesting. Have others had more of this? Wow, I think it's really, really very interesting to hear them, you know, using the current debt that they have and the climate crisis to default on that debt. One wonders if that debt is from private, you know, lenders who are not, you know, in relation to, I mean, anyway, they are related to those emitters and the historical injustice, but it's private money anyway. They will say no. And then we have another comment from Jovia who says debt has greatly frustrated. What is it? Okay, data has greatly frustrated the economies of countries that they have to use turn to their already scarce resources to serve the existing debt. And some continue to borrow to service the debt. Very absurd indeed. It's like digging a pit to cover up a pit. You know, you borrow to meet your recurrent expenditure, which includes the repayments. I think I have heard of that. It's quite sad indeed. Anyone who can unmute and make a comment? We have just only 7 minutes to wrap up. And any comment from anyone? How do we, and the comment really, the conversation that I feel is not yet clear to me is how do we move past? Because those with power are not willing to listen. Looking at what is happening in the world, May, you talked about the climate financing. Pledges were made a while back. Even with the little monies, people have not paid up. Now we talked about COVID and then the burdens of COVID. When we had resources, some have different drawing rights. Tyrell mentioned it. So how do we move this? Who has an answer to, from any panelist or whatever? How do we tangibly, one thing that we can do to say, should we refuse to pay? How do we sell the agenda of refusing to pay? And whom do we sell it to? I mean, it's a conversation I'm willing to have with my government here. But are we able, like a country, like my country, Uganda, are we able to withstand the repercussions if we refuse to pay the debt? Anyone? You know, maybe I'm going to throw it to my comrade from Aphrodite. Aphrodite, you live in Africa, and here you are, we're saying we're not going to pay. What are the consequences, and how do we live with that? Because that's an alternative that is coming from the islands in the Caribbean. They're using it. Is it something that we can take on from Africa? Tiri, are you there? Or I've lost you? Oh, Tiri, I still see
Sorry,
you.
yes, sorry, but I think I lost you in the last minute. I didn't get
clearly. Yeah, the question is, Ravi mentioned in the chat that some countries in the Caribbean, because they're using the climate crisis as the benchmark to refuse to pay or default on their debt. And I'm saying that could be a very good trick or approach to start with. And I'm looking back home in Africa. You know, there are consequences, of course, if you refuse to pay. I mean, it's not the first time Argentina failed to pay one time. What if we refuse to pay? What are the consequences? What can we live with it? Is it a method that we can use to free ourselves from the debt?
Yeah, that's a big one. That's a big one. Maybe firstly, the issue of defaulting. Defaulting actually is an option to debtor countries. Defaulting simply means that you stop paying because based on reasons given. For example, Zambia recently defaulted on paying some of its creditors, and that forced the creditors to come on the table to discuss how they can restructure their debts. That's how I will look at it. But totally refusing to pay debts has its own risks, if not consequences, because remember, the debt loans contracts are legally binding. They are legal documents, and countries can be dragged to international courts, or you can have your assets seized, as has been the case with some of the African countries, if I remember well, like Ghana or even Argentina at some point. So, but the most important is the discussion between the debtors and the creditors. Whenever a debtor country have a debt challenge, defaulting actually pushes the creditors to come on the table and discuss how best the country's debts can be restructured or solved in one or the other. But in the history of Africa and even Asia, there are what they call illegitimate debts or odious debts. And those ones, from a civil society perspective, we have always been pushing our government to not pay. We do not owe, we do not pay. For example, the case of the hidden debts of Mozambique.
I seem to have lost Terry, but your point is very clear that there's some odious debt that we can have conversation about. Ladies and gentlemen, I really want to thank you so much. I don't want to keep you longer than necessary. I